Okay, we almost have 50% of the participants voting. Would love to see who else can vote. On the bottom, you'll see a poll. Okay. Okay, great. So 50% voted. On for just another few minutes, and then I'll give the results of what the poll is. But on the bottom, you could, at any stage, you could go to the polls and vote. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a challenge on myself, and that is I'm starting right now at 7:50 exactly, and my goal is that latest 8:50 that we go through and give as much of a comprehensive situation on the Torah as we possibly can. So I'm going to do a little screen sharing today just to be able to offer some context. So here I go. This is, okay. 5 books of Moses in 1 hour flat. Here we go. Sorry. Okay, so the first book, the Torah is written in 5 sections. The first book is Bereshit, Genesis. What we're going to do is we're going to explore each book in short, but try to cover as much as possible in the book. And what I'm going to do is, as you'll see in the next slide, we will focus on the main characters that play in this book. The book of Genesis, Bereshit, covers from year number 1 in our history till year 2318. And again, this is not a historical debate of how old the world is, but for the sake of getting through the Chumash, we're going to go based on the dates of the year of the Chumash. And it starts, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And when did God create the heaven and earth? As he says, year 1. Then we meet the main characters, the big names in the book. Let's go through them. Adam and Eve, Noah and Naamah. That's actually the wife of Noah, at least according to the commentaries. Noah's 3 children, Shem, Ham, and Yafet. We meet a character, Nimrod. We meet Avram and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Yaakov and his 4 wives, Yaakov and with his 4 wives and the 13 children, and specifically child number 12 out of 13, Joseph. So let's explore a bit of each of their stories. Adam and Eve are the first people that show up on the scene, and they show up 6 days into creation. That same day, they sin, and they eat from the tree of knowledge, and no, it wasn't an apple. There's a debate in the Talmud whether it was a fig or a grape, or one other opinion, but definitely not an apple. It was just a good marketing tool. And Adam and Eve, after that, were kicked out of Eden, and they entered the world the way we know it, this planet, or at least this reality the way we know it, and they spend a long time living here. In those days, the Torah tells us at the end of the first section, at the end of the first parsha, the Torah tells us that people lived in those days 900 years, 800 years, 700 years, serious amounts of time. The longest documented fellow in the Torah is Methuselah. He's quite a known character because of that. He lived a total of 969 years, according to the Torah. Adam didn't do too bad. Adam lived 970 years. It doesn't say how long Eve lived for, how long Chava lived for. Now, Adam and Eve together have at least 3 children, but that they definitely had more because they have 3 sons and they have daughters as well, but for some reason the Torah doesn't mention it. And that's the only way their children were able to get married. So actually, according to the commentaries, what happened was Cain, so they had 3 children. The oldest one was Cain, the second one was Hevel, Abel, and the third one was Seth. Now, before Seth was even born, Cain killed Abel. And according to the opinions from the Talmud, the 2 brothers, Cain and Abel, were fighting over a woman. The first murder happened over a woman. Basically, one of them, Cain was born with 1 twin sister, and Abel was born with 2 triplets, 2 girls. And the question was, who gets the extra wife? And they fought, and Abel was killed. And the world went down and lost, I don't know, just about a quarter of its population. And later on, they have their 3rd child, Seth. Pretty much all of civilization comes from Seth. At least paternally, we all come from Seth. Cain's great-grandchild, etc., granddaughter becomes the wife of Noah. So technically, we come from Cain as well. So in case anybody starts boasting about how great their yichus is and where they come from, well, we all come from some murderer, at least way back when. 5,000 years ago. So Adam and Eve, they have 3 children. Their children get married, and those children, etc., etc., etc. And 10 generations pass. But remember, in those days, generations are much longer. Today, a generation is about 20, 25 years. In those days, a generation would be, let's say, 100 to 150 years with the lifespan that people lived. And pretty much nothing happens in the world that's of major consequence during that time. And that's why just the first 3-4 chapters of the book of Genesis skip 1,600 years of history. It pretty much focuses on one tiny event here. Cain kills Abel, builds a city. He has a grandchild named Lamech, and he has his issues. But the story is very straightforward and cruises. And by the end of the first parsha, the end of the first section of the Torah, we're already done with the story of the 1,600 years. Then comes the second parsha. Now, let me just clarify. There's 5 books of Moses. Each book, on average, has anywhere between 10 and 13 parshas. So the first book, the book of Breshit, has 12 parshiyot. 12 sections. Each week when we get up on the bima, we read one of those parshas. Some of those parshas are large, like the first one, Breshit, is 150 verses, and then there's the smallest one is 30 verses, which we're going to be reading in a few weeks, in theory, if we had a shul, and that is Vayelech. So in the second book, in the second part of book 1, it's called the book of Noah. And the book of Noah, that parsha covers a history of about 350 years. From the year 1636, when the flood takes place, till the birth of Abraham, who was born in the year 1948, and a little past that. And it's from the year 1948-2000, where I'll get to in just a moment, where really the story of the 5 books of Moses really takes on. It almost feels like the first 2 parshiyot, he's rushing through the main events that occur for the first 2,000 years of civilization. And only once Abraham and Sarah, the parents of monotheism, show up on the map, that's when we start actually hearing a real story and we start exploring depth. So what's the main story in the book, in the story of Noah? The flood. According to tradition, according to the Bible, a big flood happened in the year 1636 after the birth of Adam. It lasted for many months. The whole world was flooded, or at least wherever people lived. Other than other than Noah and his wife Naamah, their 3 sons and their 3 wives, nobody survived. Many animals made it onto the ark, and by the time they came out a year later, after the whole world had dried out, after being soaked in boiling water for a year, they come out and it's an unrecognizable world, and it's almost like creation time too. because once again, we're back to a very small group of people. It's Noah and his wife, and pretty much all living descendants are their children. According to tradition, it's not in the actual 5 books of Moses. There was another fellow who survived, his name was Og, but at least according to the text, it's Noah, his wife, and all of us are their progeny. They come out of the boat, and they have 3 sons. Their name is Shem, Ham, and Yafet. Or Sem, a Semite. Whenever we say we're a Semite, that means you come from Shem. Interesting, it's actually a misnomer. I've mentioned it a few times in the past. The word anti-Semite actually makes no sense because a lot of anti-Semites are Semites themselves, because it's not anti-Jewish. A lot of people come from Shem. The whole Arab world, the whole Middle East are descendants of Shem. Ham is mainly Africa, Northern Africa, Southern Africa, and Yafet is mainly Europe. And from their children, we see various different names, and within a very short amount of time after the flood, people start moving out and spreading out. Now, the next mega event that happens at the end of the second parsha of Noah, and that is when they decide to build a tower. This happens in Babylonia, which is in modern-day Iraq, and a big part of the Torah is going to now start focusing. In general, a big part of Jewish history focuses on Babylonia and what took place in that location. And people have a dream. They build a tower that's going to go all the way up to the sky. They build this tower to fight God or whatever reason they had, to make a name for themselves, to be famous. God is not impressed, and he creates dispersion. He suddenly inspires people to talk in different languages, and we're told that's when the beginning of languages takes place. And people start miscommunicating, and then they start fighting, and eventually people start separating and migrating. And a big part of the migration takes place at this stage. Interesting, according to the commentaries, and this is not a commentary that was discovered 100 years ago, it's a commentary that was discovered thousands of years ago. It says that one of the punishments that they had was that they turned into apes, some of them, which is interesting that according to the Torah, apes and human beings have a similar ancestor. It just, we disagree who the ancestor was. We agree that they definitely share a common ancestor, but apes come from humans, at least according to this Medrash, which I've always found fascinating, that this is way before anyone ever came up with an idea that we come from apes. Anyway, be it as it may, they move all around the world, they disperse, and various civilizations are starting to be built up. It's at this stage about 4,000 years ago, just to get context, because according to Jewish tradition, we're now in the year 5,780, and we're now talking in the year 1600s, 1700s after Adam and Eve. So it's about 4,100 years ago when really a revolutionary character shows up on the map, and this is Abraham and Sarah. Avram and Sarah are huge dynamic characters that are the parents of all faiths that believe in a God that's untangible. All monotheistic faiths give the credit to Avram and Sarah. Now, Avram, when he's a young child, he has to deal with a declared God, a very famous character. His name is Nimrod. He was the first king, really, of civilization. He literally, the name means rebel, and he rebelled against God, declared himself a god, and he was Abraham and Sarah's arch nemesis, at least in his younger years, and caused a lot of havoc. And actually, Avram's own father, Terach, worked under Nimrod. He was his chief general. And Avram had to fight against this powerful king, declaring that he believes in God. And eventually the story goes that this king threw him into the furnace, threw him into the fire, and he survived it. And after that, he slowly starts getting a following. In the year 2023, he was born in the year 1948, so it's an easy year to remember when Avram was born. 1948 is quite a big year. In the year 2023, Avram makes a journey towards Israel. And he moves to Israel, and he starts building a community around him. He has lots of issues, as goes into the third parsha, Lech Lecha Vayera. He has to then sacrifice, at the age of 100, he's blessed with a child. His child is named Isaac. 14 years earlier, he was blessed with another son, Yishmael, but that was not from his main wife. That was from a secondary wife named Hagar. But the only child that Abraham and Sarah had together is Isaac. Isaac is born in their old age. He's a miracle child, and he gets married to his first cousin, once removed, who lives back in Babylonia, and her name is Rivka. Isaac and Rivka get married, and for 20 years they cannot have children. It's interesting, all the patriarchs and matriarchs pretty much suffered from being barren, at least for some stage. And finally, 20 years after the marriage, they're blessed with twins. The older twin's name is Esau. The younger twin's name is Isaac. Esau is quite a character. He's really a rough fellow. Jacob is more soft. At some stage, Jacob kind of tricks Esau into selling him the first birthrights. And Esau gets furious, and therefore Jacob has to run away. And then we read a whole parsha, in the parsha of Vayetze, about his escapades as he travels. He goes to actually his uncle, his mother, Rebecca's brother. She came from Babylonia, as I said. She had a brother back there in Mesopotamia. His name was Lavan. And guess what? He marries his cousins as well. He marries Lavan's two daughters, and each of those two girls come together with a maidservant who he marries as well eventually. And he has 13 children in total. He has 7 children, 6 sons and 1 daughter from his first wife, Leah. He has 2 sons from Rachel, who dies in a young age, and she's buried in Bethlehem in Israel, because she dies on the road. And he has 2 children with each of the maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah. So the 12 tribes of Israel are born out of 4 wives, and then there was a 13th child who was a girl. Her name was Dinah. Now, finally, after living in by his father-in-law for quite a while, he actually lived there for 20 years and pretty much had almost all his children. He decides to travel back home to Israel to visit his father. And as I said, his wife dies on the way, and they bury his wife on the road. Interesting, all the patriarchs besides Rachel, Avram and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, and Yaakov and Leah are all buried in the same building in Hebron. If you ever went to Marat HaMachpelah, that beautiful large building there is where they were buried. And according to tradition, Adam and Eve are buried in that place as well. So we actually know where the founders of our faith and the founders of civilization are buried. Now, Jacob comes back to Israel, is expecting a bit of peace. But his 13 children have a bit of an issue. They don't like one of their brothers, Joseph. Joseph was the oldest child of his favorite wife. Yaakov's favorite wife was Rachel, and Joseph was the favorite child, and therefore he spoiled him. And by the way, the sages say from here we learn don't show favoritism because it backfires. And he gives this kid a special coat. The brothers decide to kill him, and instead they sell him as a slave. You know the story. He eventually ends up in Egypt and becomes the viceroy, second to Pharaoh. And then in the time of famine, he pretty much saves the whole area, the whole Mesopotamia, from starvation. Eventually, Jacob and his kids have to come down to live in Egypt because they don't want to die from starvation. And Joseph puts them up in a nice part of Egypt called Goshen. And the book of Genesis finishes off on a good note. Joseph dies, the family's living a good life in Egypt, and all's hunky-dory. And pretty much the book of Breshit has very few mitzvot inside. From the 613 mitzvot, there's just a handful. It's very much just a story of the beginning of the foundation of the Jewish people or the Jewish family. Next, the next book is the book of Shemot, which literally translates as names, but for some reason it was given the name Exodus, which seems appropriate because it is the story of the Exodus. But the Torah's name is Shemot. This covers a period of just over 130 years. And pretty much it's the enslavement of the Jewish people in Egypt, and then their exodus, then the Sinai experience, and then building a tabernacle for God. That's pretty much the story of Exodus, but let's go in a little more specific. The first characters we meet over there are Moshe's parents, Amram and Yocheved. Amram is the leader of the Jewish people during this time. What happened after Joseph died? Not too long after, Paro decides to enslave the Jewish people. They're getting too powerful, and they go through almost 100-year enslavement, a very, very long period of absolute torture and pain. And at some stage, Amram and Yocheved have children. They have their first daughter, Miriam. They have their son, Aaron. And then a decree comes out saying that any boy has to be drowned. So Amram divorces his wife, but his daughter convinces him to remarry because basically Amram didn't want to have any more children because why should the kid die? And she says, well, at least the girls would survive if you divorced and nobody's going to have children. So they get married and she falls pregnant again and she has Moshe. Now, Moshe only really shows up on the scene as the leader of the Jewish people at the age of 80. So for the next 80 years, the Jewish people are still enslaved, being tortured. Moshe, as the story goes, his mother puts him on the Nile, and he is found by the daughter of the Pharaoh. He's taken out, he's raised in the home of Pharaoh, and eventually at some stage he has to run away because he protects the life of a Jewish person and kills an Egyptian who was beating up a Jewish person, and therefore he unfortunately has to run away because fellow Jews tell on him to the Pharaoh. And the Torah doesn't actually say what happens to him in the next 50 years. The commentaries in the Medrash have some interesting explanations. According to one commentary, he spent 40 years in Ethiopia, but that's a story for another time, and 10 years in jail. And finally, at the age of 80, he shows up and marries the daughter of a man named Jethro. Her name is Tzipporah, in an area just next to Egypt called Midian. And that's when he becomes a shepherd for his father-in-law. And one day he's traveling and walking through the fields and he sees a burning bush, walks up to the bush, which seems to be on fire, but it's not being consumed, says, wow, this is miraculous. And suddenly he hears the voice of God, and God says, go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. Moshe fights with God for a week, we're told. He stood over there fighting with God. Finally, he agrees. Moshe comes, tries to convince Pharaoh to let the Jewish people go. The story of Exodus. Pharaoh says no, 10 plagues. And finally, the plague of the firstborn hit hard because Pharaoh's own son died, and he was a firstborn, so he was scared that he's going to die as well. And Moshe and the Jewish people finally leave. That's Passover. That's the holiday of Passover. And they go set up, they go and arrive at the sea, and God splits the sea for them. And that's the last few days of Passover. We commemorate the splitting of the sea. Then they come into the desert and they start living in tents. And that's the holiday of Sukkot, where we commemorate them living in tents. And then 49 days later, they show up to Sinai and they get the Torah. And that's the holiday of Shavuot. So it's interesting that all the three mega holidays in the Jewish calendar, besides Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which are Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, all happen in this short time span of the Exodus. That's really when the holidays form. As I said, it's a lot of information. I'm aware of that. I will send out a recording after if anybody wants to have the contents. Obviously going to come with the pages I have over here. And feel free at any stage after the shir to reach out and ask questions, but I am doing information overload. I'm very aware of that. They receive the Torah, and then that's when we start seeing a lot of laws in the Torah. Halfway through the book of Exodus, there's a parsha called Mishpatim, and that's a parsha that literally every verse is another law or two, and we really start piling on, because remember, somewhere within the 5 books of Moses, we have to squeeze in 613 commandments. So some parshas have nothing, and some parshas have as much as 70. So Mishpatim is full. In the next parsha, God says it's time to build me a home, a tabernacle, and the second half of the book of Exodus focuses on the tabernacle with one terrible interruption. Halfway through the story, we read about the Jewish people building the golden calf, the ramifications of it. A lot of people died, and Moshe begging for atonement. And guess what we got for atonement? Yom Kippur. And that was, so Yom Kippur arrives 120 days after the Torah was given. So within the first half a year of the Exodus, from Pesach till Yom Kippur, all those holidays entered. Rosh Hashanah entered for a different reason, and that's just because that's the day God created the world. But the 4 mega holidays are all squeezed into a 6-month period. Interesting. Sukkot is after Yom Kippur, but good question. But technically we should have commemorated Sukkot around Pesach. The problem is we're already commemorating Pesach then. And also in the Northern Hemisphere, Pesach is in spring. And Sukkot, if we had it in spring, people would say that we're going and eating out because it's nice, which happens to be in South Africa like that way. So God moved the holiday to October. But technically it commemorates an event that happened just after Pesach. But they moved it to October because in the Northern Hemisphere, it's a bit rainy and cold, but good question. So it's interesting. I'll be honest, till I gave you the context right now, I never realized and appreciated how within 6 months, all these mega chagim took place. Purim and Hanukkah are post-biblical, so those happened 1,000 years later, much later, but these chagim all happened in that short time. Fine. So the book of Shemot finishes off. There's 3 children, Miriam, Aaron, and Moshe, 3 powerhouses. Miriam is the leader of the Jewish woman. Aaron is the high priest in the temple. Moshe is the leader. Hur is a grandchild of Aaron who tries to intervene during the story of the golden calf, and unfortunately was killed, which made it quite personal, and that's why God got really upset, because unfortunately they committed murder in their moment of passion, in the moment when the Jews a bit lost their passion. And these 2 characters, Bezalel and Eliab, they are the 2 architects of the temple. Cool. Next book is Vayikra. The Vayikra actually it's not a story, so therefore it only really takes place, it's laws that Moshe taught on behalf of God not long after the Jews came off the temple, off the mountain. So it's 2448 or 2449 when he came down after Yom Kippur. But it's that amount of time, because I forgot to mention, when the Jewish people sinned, Moshe ended up spending 120 days in heaven with God between learning Torah and asking for forgiveness. He kind of disappeared from the Jewish community from Shavuot till Yom Kippur. He only came down twice for a few hours in between. So the big names in this book are very few. It's Moshe, Aaron, and I'll tell you the other 4 are all Aaron's children. I'll tell you about in a moment. The book of Vayikra is translated in English as Leviticus. Leviticus literally means Levi. Why? Because it's a book that talks about the laws of what it means to be a Kohen and a Levi in the temple. But it is a misnomer, because that's only the first few parshiyot, the first 3-4 sections of the Torah. The rest is, on the most part, for everybody. So in Hebrew, the name is not Leviticus, it's Vayikra, and God called. It's the book that God calls upon us to do various mitzvahs. So yes, in the beginning of the book, we read all about the sacrifices and all about the way the temple ran. Then we read about the dedication of the temple in the 3rd parsha, the parsha of Shmini. Unfortunately, a tragedy happens. Aaron is about to be inaugurated as the high priest in the new temple that they built for God in the desert. This was not a temple built of stone. This was a temple built of wood and skins of animals. It was a temporary structure that they could put on up and down based on where they moved. And Aaron's 2 sons, unfortunately, misbehaved. There's different opinions what they did wrong. According to one opinion, they were drunk. According to another opinion, they went into the Holy of Holies without permission. But the fact is that his 2 elder sons, on the day that he was about to be inaugurated and start his work, they die. So it turns into incredible tragedy. Nadab and Abihu die, and he's only left with 2 children, Elazar and Itamar. Interesting, Moshe's children, although we know their names were Gershon and Elazar and Eliezer, similar to his cousin Elazar, but it's a different name, Eliezer. We don't know much about them. They don't really place much in Jewish history. Aaron's children much more do, because they become the next high priests, etc. So Nadav and Abihu die, and Elazar and Itamar take over. Elazar will eventually inherit his father's role as the high priest, and Itamar will inherit it after his brother Elazar dies, according to many. So we then read about various laws in this book. We read about a metzora, which is an ancient kind of leprosy that people used to get on their skin. We read about various kinds of purities and impurities. Today, the only applicable purity and impurity really is Kohanim are not allowed to go into cemeteries, and women, when they menstruate, they become impure until they go to mikvah. But in those days, impurity was a thing that took over the lives of men, women, everybody, all day, every day. 1/6 of the Talmud, at least the Mishnah part of the Talmud, is dedicated to the laws of purity and impurity. It was such an all-consuming part of Jewish life, which today really plays a very small part in Jewish life. Then we read about God introduces the laws of the Chagim. So now he tells us how to celebrate Pesach and how to celebrate Sukkot and how to celebrate Shavuot and to count the Omer and what to do on Yom Kippur and what to do on Rosh Hashanah. He allows us all to know that, and that gets unpacked towards the end. And in the final chapter, we read blessings and curses, where God kind of warns the Jewish people: if they behave, they get X, and if they misbehave, they get X. So the story, other than the story of Nadav and Avihu dying in this episode, there's pretty much no narratives in this entire book. It's a book of laws, some of them applicable till today, and many of them just applicable in temple times. The fourth book, which we actually find ourselves in now, this time of the year, is the book of Bamidbar, which literally translates as in the desert, but the English name is Numbers. Numbers because at the beginning they start counting the Jewish people, how many there are. Bamidbar, the original name in the Torah, is Bamidbar because all these episodes happen in the desert. Now, unlike the previous book, which was mainly laws, this book, on the most part, is mainly stories. And this is when you really start getting to know the Jewish people. Think of it like this, for the sake of just clarity. The book of Genesis is stories. The book of Exodus, half stories, half laws. Book of Leviticus, fully laws. Book of Numbers, pretty much back to the story. So all the stories of the Jews kvetching and all the complaints and the spies and all the stories that happen in the desert that have become part of the Jewish fabric and the Jewish story happen in this. The fifth book, which we'll discuss in a moment, no stories at all. It's Moshe's longest drasha. It's the rabbi's longest drasha ever given in history. We'll get to that in a moment. So in the book of Bamidbar, we read about how the Jewish people camped in the desert. Now, interesting, I want to clarify. When we talk about the Jews in the desert, even with all the stories we learn, we don't focus on the 40 years. We only focus on the first year or two that they were in the desert and the final year. The middle 38 years don't really get a mention. All we know about them is where they moved during those 40 years, but we don't actually know episodes that happened to them for the 40 years. We only know episodes that happened in the first 18 to 24 months and the last year. So what episodes do we know about? The mega ones. We know about the Jews complaining about traveling too long, and God unfortunately punishes them. We see the Jews complaining about the man, that it's too tasteless and doesn't feel good, and God sends them meat, and unfortunately it doesn't end too well either in the book about, in the Parsha Ba'alotcha. Then we read the story of the spies. Moshe appoints 12 spies to go check out Israel. This is still only a year after the Exodus. The Jewish people were still convinced they're about to go into the land. The 12 spies go, 10 of them come back with bad reports. Only 2 of them come back with the reports that say that we can do it. The other 10 said we can't. The Jewish people start mourning and groaning and feeling sorry for themselves. And God says, you know what? Well, 40 years in the desert, 39 years. So it was actually this time of the year. The spies were sent and they came back on Tisha B'Av, which we commemorate in just over a month. And God said, unfortunately, that day that the Jews cried, there's going to be a lot of tragedies. And unfortunately, many tragedies throughout Jewish history happened on Tisha B'Av, including the Spanish Inquisition, certain things in the Holocaust, and the destruction of the 2 temples, etc., etc. So Shlach, which we read a few weeks ago, it's a heartbreaking story because ultimately the 10 spies don't come back with good reports, and it has huge ramifications. All the Jewish men were going to die in the desert when they turned 60. Interesting what would happen every single year at this time of the year. It's actually a few days after Tisha B'Av, the 15th day of the month of Av. They would go dig them, whoever turned 60 that year would go dig themselves a grave and go to sleep at night and not wake up, because God said everyone's going to die at 60. And only in the last year, the final group of people that were supposed to die, they never died. They would actually, each year on the 9th of Avsari, on the day that they complained, that's the day that they would lay down in the grave and die. So it was quite a hectic time. Women were never part of any of this trouble. So it looks like there was a lot of older women by the time the Jewish people come into Israel, and no older men. The oldest man was 59, 60, and the women weren't punished. We don't really read about, other than Miriam's passing, the women were not part of the golden calf. They were not part of the spies. All the big issues we're told the women were not part of, and therefore they were not punished. Yeah, if the world was run by women, halavai. Now, then we come to last week's Parsha, which was the Parsha of Korach. And this is when things get even more hectic, because this time it's actually Moshe's first cousin who rebels against him. He wants Moshe's position. He claims that he has a right to the position. He wants Aaron's position. Things get very political. Eventually, God creates a hole in the ground, and Korach and his family and a few other co-conspirators get swallowed into the ground. It didn't end pretty. There's also the story of Moshe's own siblings gossiping about him and questioning his decisions, and God punishes his older sister Miriam with leprosy for talking against her younger brother, even though she didn't do it with evil intent. She was just questioning why he divorced his wife or separated himself from his wife. And Moshe's reason was because he didn't feel like a domestic life is appropriate when God's talking to you every other day, every other minute. Then we come to this week's Parsha. Interesting, Chukat Balak. We're reading 2 Parsha this week. And this week's Parsha transitions from year number 1, or the first 18 months after the Exodus, to the final year, to the final few months. There's like this transition. We don't know what happened in the middle of 38 years. And then we show up to the last year. During the last year, it's pretty much 39 years, almost exactly, since the Exodus. And it starts off with the death of Miriam. Miriam dies at this stage. 4 months later, her brother Aaron will die. And 4 months after that, 8 months after that, her brother Moshe will die. So just to go through some of the characters, I said Moses, we discussed the 3 sons of Levi and the various responsibilities they had in the temple, the 12 tribes of Israel, how they camped, the story of the spies. Dasan, Aviram, and Korach are all the conspirators against Moshe. Faribel makers just includes everybody else. And then Aaron and Miriam both pass away in this week's Parsha. Miriam passes away in the month of Nisan, which is the month of the Exodus, and Aaron passes away in the month of Av, which is the upcoming Jewish month, next month, August time. And 8 months after that, in March, the next year, in Adar, Moshe is going to die. So like the entire Jewish leadership that guided the Jewish people in the desert is knocked out within 12 months. And a whole new leadership has to come up. Now, Miriam's death leads to a tragedy because there's no water. All the water that the Jewish people used to get was called the well of Miriam in the desert. And once she died, the well dried up and all the Jewish people complained. There's nothing to drink. And God tells Moshe, go talk to the rock. Moshe tries to talk to the rock. It doesn't work. He hits the rock and the rock gives out water. And God said, because you didn't listen to me and you didn't follow me to the letter, and you kind of, you made believe as if my word wasn't good enough, unfortunately, you and your brother Aaron are going to have to die in the desert. And not too long after that, Aaron dies, and his son Elazar takes over as the high priest for the final few months in the desert, and as the Jewish people make it into the Holy Land. Then it's already towards the end of the 40th year. Moshe knows that he's not going to make it into Israel, but it's time to start moving the Jewish people closer to the border. This time, the Jewish people are traveling where today is Jordan. So that's east of Israel. They're over the Jordan River. They're in Transjordan, and they're trying to get through various countries. They try to negotiate with Sichon, who's a king in one place, and Og, who's a king in another place. They go out to fight the Jewish people. The Jewish people win them over and take over their lands. And although they're not a part of Israel proper, because they're on the other side of the Jordan, some of the tribes decide to settle over there and not move into Israel proper. We're told that when Mashiach comes, that part, the other side of the river, is going to become part of the greater Israel. But at that stage, it wasn't part of the greater Israel, although 2.5 tribes, the tribe of Reuven, Gad, and half of Menashe, settled in that side of the river, which actually we discuss in next week's Parsha. We also discuss various other kings who are getting worried about the Jewish people. In this week's parsha, Balak hires a sorcerer, Bilam, to curse the Jewish people because Balak is scared. By the end, Bilam blesses the Jewish people, but he does give one good advice, bad advice to Balak at the end. Says, why don't you get non-Jewish women to seduce the Jewish men, which unfortunately happens at the end of this week's parsha. The men are seduced, a plague starts, and things are getting really hectic, especially one of the Jewish leaders, Zimri, is flaunting his non-Jewish woman to Moshe and kind of causing a lot of havoc, and things get to a head. And Moshe's nephew, great-nephew Pinchas, takes a knife, kills this character Zimri, and the plague stops. And Pinchas then gets a whole part of the Torah dedicated to him. And although he stopped the plague in quite an aggressive way, because that's what God wanted at the moment, we're told that God blessed him, and he eventually became Elijah the prophet. Elijah the prophet was at least his soul, or the reincarnation of him. Towards the end of the book of Numbers, I'm doing quite well on time. Towards the end of the book of Numbers, we read about all the journeys of the Jewish people, all the stops they did. It's a bunch of, if you go to the final parsha, the Parsha Maseh, you'll see 40 plus names of locations that they stopped, 42 places, Membes, Masos, 42 stops they had. Some of their stops would be for a month, some of this, one stop was for 20 years, and some stops would be for barely a day. And each time they had to open camp. Remember, there was about 2 to 3 million Jews moving around the desert. So each time to pack and unpack was a mission and a half. Forget about just taking down the tabernacle and putting it up. Just think about the amount of families and then setting up, and then each family had to set up in their own way. Each tribe had to be in their own section, each family within a tribe, and make sure that your tent the entrance doesn't face the entrance of the other tent, so keep some privacy. It was quite an escapade. We're told that they were surrounded by clouds of glory in the merit of Aaron for the 40 years. And yeah, and the end of the book of Numbers pretty much finishes off 40 years minus a month after the Exodus, minus 2 months. The Exodus, as if you remember, happened in April, May, Nisan, and now we are going to be in February, 40 years later. Moshe is about to die. He's going to die in 37 days. It's the first day of the month of Shvat, and Moshe starts the longest drasha ever. Pretty much the entire 5th book of Dvarim is called, it's the words of Moshe. It's spoken in first person. The first 4 books of Moses are spoken as third person. It's a storyteller telling you what happened with X, Y, and Z. You know, Avram went to do this, Isaac went to do this. The 5th book is written in first person. I told you this, and I'm telling you this, because it's Moshe's speech. For some reason, in English, they came up with the most complicated name. It means, it's pronounced Deuteronomy, which actually means repetition, because some of the ideas in here are repeated from previously. So for example, in Moshe's speech, he's going to repeat the story of Sinai. He's going to repeat the story, part of the story of the Exodus. He's going to repeat the part of the story of the golden calf and other elements that took place. But not all of it. There's a lot of original laws within this 5th book, within the book of Devarim. So there's actually very few names over here. There's pretty much just one name, Moshe, and the person who takes him over, Joshua. But let me give you a overview of what happens over here, because this is actually, in many ways, it gives you perspective on the other 4, how this book actually was formed. Because remember, many people have this myth that Moshe came down the mountain with the 5 books of Moses. The problem is 5 books of Moses include, a big part of it are stories that take place, at least 50% of it are stories that take place after Sinai. So he didn't come down with the 5 books of Moses, he came down with the tablets, with the 10 commandments, and with the oral law, and with many mitzvot, but it wasn't transcribed. The Chumash, this book, the Chumash, or the Torah that we have in the Shul, was not given yet. It's going to be happening in this, towards the end of this book. So Moshe starts off in the first 3 parshas in the book of Deuteronomy. He is focusing on certain episodes. He's giving what's called a Musar speech. He's giving them a bit of a reprimand. He's about to pass away. He knows he's about to pass away, and exactly a month and 3 days after he passes away, the Jewish people will go into the Holy Land under Joshua. So he knows that he has to give them his final thoughts. So he lays into them quite harsh, lovingly but harsh. Then after the first 3 parshas where he focuses on certain things that he feels they need to learn and do better next time, he then goes and starts teaching them new laws. And in the parsha of A, he tells them various laws about living in Jerusalem in the future, false prophets. How do you know what's a good prophet? What's a false prophet? How do you know who to follow? How do you stay true? Then he continues and talks about setting up justice systems in the parsha of Shoftim, justice and policemen to enforce, and laws of monetary and laws of capital punishment. When is there capital punishment? When there isn't? How to set up justice systems, etc., etc. He spends quite a bit of time on that. Then he starts talking about the laws of war, because the Jewish people are about to go into the Holy Land and about to conquer it, and they're going to have to wage wars to conquer the land. So he talks about various things that they're going to face once they're in the heat of war, what they can do, what they cannot do, when they should negotiate for peace, how they should negotiate for peace. He spends a lot of time on that. Then he comes and gives them a hardcore warning, similar to what God did in the book of Leviticus. If you do good, then you get this. If you don't do good, you get this. He does it much more intense. He gives a lot of blessings, but he also gives a serious, almost 60 verses of threats. What's going to happen if the Jewish people don't follow? He's really giving it into them, telling them, guys, you better hold yourself together. I'm leaving you, but don't lose the path. And in the final 4 parshas, which are small ones, Nitzavim, Vayelech, Hazinu, V'zot HaBracha, all combined, technically they're the size of one large parsha, but they're split into 4 different parshas. Those 4 parshas really focus on the last day of Moshe's life, which is the 7th of Adar. Just to give you context, that's about March time. It's a week before Purim. That's Moshe's Yartzeit. We know when he died, but we don't know where he's buried. Even the Torah says nobody knows where Moshe's buried. God buried him and no one will know. And the last day of his life, a lot happens. This is the time that he has to wrap up the whole Torah, because again, the 5 books of Moses close at the death of Moses. There is no mention in the 5 books of Moses of Moshe, of the Jewish people arriving in Israel. That only happens in the book of Joshua, which is one of the books of the prophets, but it's not nearly at the spiritual level of the 5 books of Moshe. We read the Haftorah from those books. They're obviously part of what's called the canon, part of the Bible, part of the Old Testament, as the Christians will refer to it. But ultimately, it's not at the level of the 5 books of Moshe, the Torah. The 5 books of Moshe end at the end of Moshe's life. But it's interesting because Moshe has to write down his last moments, because it actually, in the last 12 verses, it describes Moshe dies and God buries him, and this takes place and that takes place, which is quite fascinating, because ultimately, what happened here? So the Talmud has a debate whether God was telling Moshe what to write down, those last 12 verses, and Moshe was just writing it with tears, or whether God wrote it himself. But the point is, it was at this final day that Moshe finishes up the Torah. It seems he was writing it throughout the years. According to some opinions, he actually wrote the whole Torah in one day in a miraculous way. But it's at the end of his life, his final gift to the Jewish people, before he steps down from his role as the Jewish leader, he hands them over the book. He prepares 13 books, he gives them to the 12 tribes, and one he keeps next to the Holy Temple. And that's where the 5 books of Moses come from. That's why they're actually called 5 books of Moshe. They're not called the 5 books of God. Because although they're obviously God-inspired, and we're told that God told them every word to write, ultimately, they were transcribed by Moshe. And that is what's considered the written law. When we refer to the written law and the oral law, the written law of the Torah is the 5 books of Moses. All 613 mitzvahs are found in the 5 books. There are various commentaries throughout the years who count how many mitzvahs in each parasha. There's a few arguments about which of the mitzvahs are part of the 613, which ones aren't, because there's a few of them beyond 613 and they have to squeeze. We have a tradition at 613, so the question is which ones fit in, which ones fit out. There's some major debates between some of the greatest commentators in history, but on the most part, 99%, we know what the 613 mitzvahs are, and they all fit into that portion. And Moshe hands over the Jewish people this book. And then on the 7th of Adar, he dies. And that's when the book closes, which is quite interesting because it's quite an anticlimax if you think about it. Because let's go back. Adam, Eve, Noah, etc., etc. Who was the first person that told that the Jewish people would finally go to Israel and this is the land? Abraham was told that when he went to Israel. How long before this is it? This is over 400. By the time the Jewish people come to the gate of Israel, it's 470 years after Abraham was promised this land. Half a millennium. So the whole Torah, almost from the beginning, is a journey of God promising you'll make it to the Holy Land, you'll make it to the Holy Land, you'll get there, and then at the end of the book, if you wouldn't have the book of Joshua, you wouldn't know what happened. All you know is the Jewish people are at the gate of Israel, but they're still on the wrong side of the Jordan. Moshe is gone, and a new leader is appointed, Joshua, his close and favorite student. So what do I hope you take out of this? I have to just give myself a compliment on the timing. 50 minutes, barely. Here's what I want. And obviously, I can't do justice to the 5 books of the Torah in 50 minutes. I know that. But what I want, and what I believe strongly is a lot of us know a lot more than we give ourselves credit for, but we lack context. Why I like giving these lectures is just to take a lot of information that we have and to offer context. So for example, when I walk over to you and we have a discussion and I mention, Avram and Sarah, and then Moses, okay, so who's where and what's how? So I know lots of story of Moses, I know lots of stories of Abraham, but when happened what? And what I hope you can just get if you actually, and I encourage you to take a Chumash, whichever Chumash you have. If not, please go to a store and buy a Chumash and start teaching yourself this story, but try to keep it always in your mind in context. I'll send you this recording if you want to just, I don't think this is the ultimate, way of putting it, but I think for me, at least, it's always helped me to give things years, dates. Okay, so when does this take place? Which book is this in? What does this book focus on? What am I going to now? And if I get lost, how do I know how to come back into the narrative? And I hope that I offered you that. And I encourage you during this lockdown period, we're not reading from the Torah in a literal sense. We're not getting aliyot, but it is a time that we have some time in our hands and we are all looking for some serenity. This is the most published book in history. It's the most studied book. It is the foundation of our faith. Yes, to fully understand it, you need lots of commentaries and tremendous amount of oral law and this and that, I agree. But even simply studying these 5, this book will give you such amount of grounding. Okay, I received another question. Please, can you clarify? A bit confused. 5 books of Moses is the Torah? Correct. Which Moshe wrote? Correct. Under God's inspiration, Moshe wrote this. But Hashem gave us the Torah. Hashem gave us the 10 Commandments at Sinai and then taught the Torah to Moshe. He taught it to him on the 120 days that he was up there in heaven. And then Moshe transcribes it under divine inspiration before the Jewish people make it into the Holy Land. Now, Simchas Torah, which is after Sukkot, that is a separate chag entirely. That is just, what happens is the rabbis instituted a chag at the end of Sukkot where we start, because the beginning of the Jewish year is Rosh Hashanah, but the first few weeks, we're not really reading the regular parshas, we're reading special readings for the chagim. Each chag has its own unique reading that's collected out of the 5 books of Moshe, but it doesn't go in order. When does the new order start? Right after the chagim. So we finish a cycle of reading the 53 parshiyot on Simchas Torah, and we start the new cycle then. But the cycle of 53 parashiyot doesn't necessarily coincide with the chagim that happen. For example, we usually read every year the stories of Exodus and the whole story of Mitzrayim, Egypt, in January, February, even though Pesach's in April, because the cycle of reading the 53 parashiyot is a cycle that starts post-Chagim, the final Chag of Simchas Torah, which is after Sukkot. We start it then, we go a full cycle around, and then we come back Simchas Torah. But that's a very good question. So, yes, it is important to clarify what the 5 books of Moses and what the Torah is, because yes, this has the ultimate level of holiness. But no, this is not what Moshe came down the mountain with. Interesting, there was a stage in Jewish history that the people made a big deal of the Ten Commandments, saying that they're more authentic than the 5 books of Moshe. And that's why the rabbis, to negate that, they never made a big fuss of the 10 Commandments. And therefore, like, you don't get a bigger reward if you do the 10 Commandments. Many people don't even know the 10 Commandments. So like in our shul, we happen to have the 10 Commandments on the wall, but the 10 Commandments, we don't even say them in davening. We don't give them a special mention. We mention other things. We mention the principles of our faith. We mention things that we have to remember every single day, the Shesh Skirot, the 6 remembrances. We don't mention the 10 Commandments because we don't want to put them on a higher pedestal than everything else. On Shavuot, we commemorate that event. But ultimately, when it comes to the level of revelation, it's the same revelation that happens for that and the Torah. They all, the word of God as passed over Moshe, which is another, just finishing off a few insights, which is interesting that from the beginning of Jewish history, the role of teachers. In other words, many people will often say, why do I need a teacher? A rebbitzin, a rabbi, a mentor, a guide. Let me talk directly to God. And of course, there's validity. We daven directly talk to God. But at the same time, there was always this idea of somebody almost being an intermediary, but not in the Christian way where like you serve them, but intermediary in the way that you work through them to God. You don't put them as a deity and make them independent of God, but you appreciate Moshe as that person. We say the first words we teach a child before even Shema Yisrael, the first words we teach our children is Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe. What does that mean? The Torah was commanded to us by Moshe. Again, Moshe commanded the Torah? God. No, because it happened through Moshe. There was this incredible role of Jewish leaders from the beginning. Now, obviously, I'm not here to sit there putting corrupt leaders on a pedestal, but the idea of a good, worthy leader playing a role within the Jewish community and serving as a healthy intermediary was always there in the Jewish people. It's not a modern invention. It's always been there. And the mere fact that we call it Torah Moshe, the Torah of Moshe, we even say the words Moshe emet v'Torato emet. Moshe is true and his Torah is true. It's incredible how much we put him on a pedestal in the value that he gave the Torah, which I think is quite insightful. And I think one of the reasons for that is because Torah throughout the generations always had to be taught by the rabbis of its time. If the Torah was only given by God and not by Moshe and not given credit to the leader at the time, then nobody would ever take halachic authority seriously. But one of the big things that God teaches us is that each generation has its halachic deciders and leaders who could then set the policy. Obviously, they cannot negate Torah, that they don't have the right, but they could clarify it for the context of the time. Because as much as Torah is a static book, it's also an evolving book based on evolving circumstances. For example, a lot of halachot that no rabbi ever learned before Corona suddenly became applicable. Which rabbi was studying 6 months ago the laws of plagues and minions? Nobody. I don't think there was any professional on plagues in Judaism because the last time we had a plague was 1918. And now we have to go dig up in Torah and obviously create, based on the principles of Torah, lessons for our time. But that's part of the previous conversation we had on the role of the oral law. So I want to thank you so much for joining. I will send out the recording just now. But I hope that you found this a bit insightful. Again, lots of information to process, but please get a Chumash and just go through it. If sometimes the reading gets a bit monotonous, it's fine. Some of it's a bit repetitive, at least superficially, it's fine. Go through it, just move through it and go to the next page. And eventually it builds up again. And once you've gone through it a few times and you understand the context, then maybe you could start going into depth. The problem is if you start going into depth at the beginning without offering the context, you actually get lost in the forest, and you don't know what the trees are, what the forest is. So I would recommend you to, at least in a small amount of time, a month or 2 months, try to just cover ground, get the story, have a grasp on what's going on, and then move forward. I want to thank you all for participating, and I really appreciate each and every one of you that joined. As always, I'll finish off with some
I was young, I heard a tale of a giant standing tall, and his son, oh so small. They shared a dream to see the king. They hungered for the day and hurried on their way. As they neared the two despair, a wall rose to the skies above the giant's eyes. Wait, my son, said he, climb upon me, and after you arise, you will be my giants want to do. So stand and take the credit. We will be the ones to end it. Though we're small, we're standing tall like soldiers. We're riding high, 'cause we're on our father's shoulders. Our fathers were giants, righteous men. We are small compared to them, but our deeds, upon their deeds, together they will bring Moshiach, our King. Moshiach, Moshiach, our King. And we will do it, brothers, after us. There'll be no others. You and I will do what giants want to do. So stand and take the credit. We will be the ones to end it. Though we're small, we're standing tall like soldiers. Riding high, 'cause we're on our father's shoulders. It's up to us to hammer home that final blow. Our father started long ago, compelling us to fight.